In a world where love often speaks in different languages, there exists a charming intersection between two hearts from opposite sides of the globe: the fiery, passionate Ukrainian woman and the warm, endlessly patient Filipino man. This story explores the light-hearted and heartwarming cultural contrasts between Filipino boyfriends and Ukrainian boyfriends, told through the eyes of a narrator who has watched, observed, and quietly smiled at the growing number of cross-cultural couples, discovering that love, no matter how far apart the roots, can still bloom beautifully in the tropics. It begins with the Ukrainian woman's reflection, a woman who grew up in a place where winter dominates the landscape for half the year, where people are strong, proud, and practical. Back in Ukraine, relationships were often marked by a sense of equality, sometimes competitiveness, and a bit of emotional distance. Ukrainian men, as she described, were providers, responsible, disciplined, and hardworking, but often emotionally reserved. They showed love through action, not words. A Ukrainian boyfriend would shovel your walkway, fix your car, or bring you flowers, but rarely would he say, "I love you," unless the moment demanded it. But then came her time in the Philippines, and that was when everything changed. The contrast was almost overwhelming at first. Filipino men, she noticed, had this natural softness, this sense of care and gentleness that didn't need to be hidden. They were not afraid to be emotional. They were proud of being affectionate. Where a Ukrainian boyfriend might wait for a special day to express love, a Filipino boyfriend would say, "I miss you," 3 times before lunch. And somehow it didn't feel clingy. It felt sincere, the kind of warmth you didn't know you needed until it wrapped around your heart. From the very first time she dated a Filipino man, she found herself surprised by how he treated her, not just as a girlfriend, but as someone to be adored. There was that classic Filipino way of being malaga, caring in ways that felt both charming and old-fashioned. He would check if she had eaten, remind her to drink water, and insist she text him when she got home safely. In Ukraine, she was used to independence, but in the Philippines, she discovered the beauty of being looked after, not because she was weak, but because someone genuinely wanted her to feel safe. But of course, it wasn't all perfect. She also noticed the funny quirks, the Filipino time that could drive a punctual Ukrainian woman crazy. Filipino boyfriends had an almost mystical ability to say, "on the way," when they were still in the shower. And when they finally arrived, they would flash that guilty smile that somehow made it impossible to stay mad. Ukrainian boyfriends, on the other hand, were almost too punctual. If you said 3 a while, they'd be there at 2:55, waiting with a serious face. It was discipline versus charm, structure versus spontaneity. The documentary Voice explores this contrast like a cultural study, yet it never loses the humor. When Ukrainian boyfriends take their girlfriends on dates, it's often planned. Dinner reservations, perhaps a concert, always with purpose. Filipino boyfriends? Sometimes the best dates happen at Jollibee or on a motorbike under the rain. The romance isn't in the grandeur, it's in the laughter, the shared umbrella, and the silly conversations about whether pineapple belongs on pizza. And somehow, that simple joy felt richer than all the fine dining in Kyiv. Then came the question of pride. Ukrainian men were proud, deeply proud, of being strong and independent. They carried their masculinity like armor, and while it made them dependable, it also created distance. Filipino men had pride too, but of a different kind. They took pride in making their partner laugh, in being silly, in making her feel like she was the most beautiful woman in the world, even if her hair was messy or her shirt had a food stain. The Filipino boyfriend's confidence wasn't in dominance, but in devotion. That difference became the heart of her fascination. Another thing she couldn't ignore was how family-centered Filipinos were. It was both overwhelming and heart-melting. In Ukraine, relationships were more private. You'd introduce your partner to family only after months, sometimes years. But in the Philippines, if you dated a Filipino man, you met the whole clan before you could blink. There was the mother, who wanted to cook for you, the auntie who asked if you could sing, and the cousin who tried to add you on Facebook immediately. At first, she was shy, but later, she realized this was love, not just from him, but from everyone around him. To love a Filipino boyfriend was to inherit a family. She found herself laughing more than ever before. Filipino humor was infectious. Jokes flowed even during serious moments. When her Ukrainian friends asked her what it was like to date a Filipino, she answered with a smile, "It's like living in a sitcom. You never know what will happen, but somehow you always end up happy." She loved how Filipino men could turn the most stressful situation into something light. Even arguments ended with laughter. If they fought, her Filipino boyfriend would suddenly say, "Okay na, let's eat," and she couldn't resist. Food always won. The narrator explains that it wasn't just about humor or affection, it was also about resilience. Filipino boyfriends carried an unshakable positivity, a kind of emotional survival instinct shaped by generations of adversity. They didn't complain much. They found solutions. They believed everything would be okay. That optimism rubbed off on her. In Ukraine, where people sometimes braced for hardship with stoic faces, she found herself adapting to a Filipino kind of hope, smiling even when life was hard. Of course, she still noticed some cultural challenges. Filipino men were sweet, but sometimes shy. In Ukraine, men often took bold steps, confident, sometimes too much so. But in the Philippines, it was different. A Filipino man might secretly adore you for months before confessing. He'd be your best friend first, and only when he couldn't hold it in anymore would he say, "Actually, I like you." That humility, that slow burn of love, touched her deeply. It wasn't rushed. It was sincere. There were moments that truly captured her heart. Small gestures, like how her Filipino boyfriend would offer his jacket, carry her bag even when she refused, or buy her snacks just because. In Ukraine, men did those things too, but with formality. Filipino men did it playfully, with charm, with a smile that made you feel seen. She used to think love had to be grand, but now she saw it could be simple. As simple as holding hands while walking to the nearest sari-sari store. When she compared both worlds, she didn't think one was better than the other. She saw beauty in both. Ukrainian boyfriends were pillars of strength. Filipino boyfriends were rivers of warmth. One gave structure, the other gave soul. But if she had to choose which love made her feel most alive, she'd whisper without hesitation, it was the Filipino kind. Because it wasn't just about romance, it was about belonging, laughter, and the daily celebration of life's little things. The documentary tone captures her journey as not just a romantic discovery, but a cultural awakening. She realized that being loved by a Filipino wasn't about changing who she was, it was about rediscovering her own softness. The kind she had buried under layers of independence and practicality. With him, she learned to laugh louder, to care deeper, to say, "I love you," more often, and to believe that maybe, just maybe, the simplest love stories are the most extraordinary. As the film-like narrative closes the first chapter, she looks back on her transformation. The Ukrainian woman who once thought romance was about perfection now believes it's about sincerity. Her Filipino boyfriend might not bring roses every day, but he brings joy, patience, and an unshakable belief that love should be light and happy, not heavy and complicated. And in that realization, she finds something beautiful. A harmony between two worlds, where laughter replaces silence and care replaces pride. As the days turned into months, the Ukrainian woman began to notice something even deeper than just the surface-level contrast between Filipino and Ukrainian men. What fascinated her most wasn't just the gestures, the smiles, or the cultural quirks. It was the emotional fabric that defined how these men loved, stayed loyal, and built their sense of connection. Beneath the jokes and gentle teasing, she discovered something rare. A quiet strength rooted in faith, family, and a kind of loyalty she hadn't seen before. In Ukraine, loyalty was often measured in silence. A man's devotion wasn't in how often he said, "I love you," but in how consistently he stayed, how much responsibility he carried, and how little he complained. Ukrainian men believed that showing too much emotion might weaken their image. Love was duty, not poetry. It was a promise held behind a stoic expression. Reliable, yes, but sometimes distant. You could sit beside a Ukrainian boyfriend for an hour without speaking, and somehow that silence was supposed to mean peace, comfort, and mutual understanding. But in the Philippines, everything was louder, brighter. The Filipino boyfriend didn't just love in silence. He made you feel it every day. Loyalty wasn't just a duty, it was devotion. He would hold your hand in public, text you good morning, check in at lunchtime, and remind you to pray before bed. He was there, not just physically, but emotionally. To her, that was something entirely new, to feel seen, heard, and valued in every small moment. It made her laugh sometimes, because Filipino men were so expressive that even jealousy became funny. While a Ukrainian boyfriend might not notice if someone flirted with you at a cafe, a Filipino boyfriend would notice too much. He'd get jealous if you smiled at the waiter, then immediately apologize and bring you milk tea. "I'm sorry, I just love you too much," he'd say, and she'd melt. It was possessive but sweet, almost boyish in its honesty. It wasn't about control. It was about care. She began to see that Filipino loyalty wasn't born from fear of loss. It came from gratitude. When a Filipino man loved you, he genuinely felt lucky. He'd say it out loud, sometimes in the simplest ways. "I'm so happy you're here. You're my blessing. Salamat sayo." These phrases held more warmth than entire poems. In contrast, Ukrainian men rarely said such things. They showed love through hard work, through their presence, through protection. It was strong, but it lacked the constant reassurance her heart now quietly craved. The narrator paints a picture of the Ukrainian woman slowly realizing how faith plays a big role in Filipino relationships. Religion wasn't just a background belief, it was a daily rhythm. Filipino boyfriends prayed before meals, thanked God for small things, and saw love itself as a blessing to protect. It surprised her at first. In Ukraine, faith was more private, something you carried quietly, not something you displayed. But her Filipino boyfriend's faith wasn't about preaching, it was about gratitude. It made him gentle, patient, forgiving. That patience, she noticed, was one of the biggest differences. Ukrainian men were direct, sometimes fiery. Arguments could escalate quickly, voices could rise, emotions could spill like vodka from a cracked glass. But Filipino boyfriends rarely fought like that. If tension appeared, he'd say softly, "Huwag tayo mag-away," or "let's not fight." He'd smile, disarm the tension with humor, and remind her that love should never feel like a battlefield. It wasn't avoidance, it was emotional intelligence. Filipino men had mastered the art of calming storms with laughter. It didn't mean they were perfect. Filipino boyfriends could also be stubborn, sensitive, or overly accommodating. Sometimes their desire to keep peace meant avoiding difficult conversations. But even then, their heart was in the right place. They didn't want to hurt. They didn't want to see tears. They'd rather absorb the blame than see you cry. In Ukraine, love sometimes felt like a test of strength. In the Philippines, it felt like a lesson in kindness. One day, while having lunch with her Filipino boyfriend's family, she observed something that touched her deeply. His father, quiet but gentle, prepared rice while his mother cooked. His brothers helped clean. Everyone ate together, laughed, and shared stories. There was no rush, no pressure, just togetherness. She remembered how back home, mealtimes could be quick, practical. Here, food was more than food. It was an expression of care, a way to say "I love you" without words. She thought of her Ukrainian ex-boyfriend, hardworking, loyal, but often absent-minded when it came to emotional warmth. He would work long hours, save money, fix things, but rarely pause to simply enjoy the moment. With her Filipino boyfriend, life slowed down. It wasn't about having more, it was about feeling more. Even the smallest gesture, a shared halo, a spontaneous karaoke night, or a good morning text, felt like proof that love didn't need to be complex to be real. The documentary tone highlights how Filipino men balance humility and pride in love. They're proud of their partners, proudly showing photos, bragging to their friends, introducing them to everyone. Yet they never lose their humility. They say sorry even when they aren't at fault. They tease, they laugh at themselves, and they never pretend to be perfect. This self-awareness charmed her endlessly. Ukrainian men were proud too, but sometimes too proud. Apologies were rare. In the Philippines, saying sorry was almost an art form. It wasn't weakness. It was love speaking softly. Then came one of her most profound realizations. Filipino relationships weren't just about two people. They were about community. The whole neighborhood often played a part. The titas had opinions. The barkada had advice. Even the local tricycle driver who saw you every day would ask, "Kayo pa ba?" It was overwhelming at first, like being part of a telenovela. But eventually she found it comforting. In the Philippines, love wasn't private, but it was protected. Everyone wanted to see you happy. She compared that to Ukraine, where relationships were guarded and individualistic. People kept their emotions close. There was privacy, yes, but also isolation. In the Philippines, she never felt alone. If she had a fight with her boyfriend, his mother would message her, "Huwag ka na magtampo, he loves you." It made her laugh, but also melt. How could anyone stay angry in a country where even mothers-in-law acted like matchmakers? As her connection deepened, she realized that Filipino loyalty wasn't just about staying faithful, it was about being consistent. Her boyfriend didn't just love her on special days. He showed it every day. He remembered little details, her favorite snack, her allergies, her mood swings before her period. He cared without needing a reason. In Ukraine, men often expressed loyalty by enduring hardships. In the Philippines, men expressed it by making sure you never felt them. What struck her most was how Filipino men could make love feel light. Even when life was tough, they still joked, still smiled, still found reasons to be grateful. Ukrainian men, molded by their country's history and struggle, carried a certain heaviness, a seriousness about life and survival. Filipino men, despite their own challenges, carried lightness. That lightness was contagious. It taught her that love didn't always need to be serious to be strong. Sometimes laughter was its own form of strength. Through her eyes, the story becomes a gentle love letter to Filipino men, but also a reflection on what the world could learn from them. In a time where people overthink relationships, here was a culture that reminded her of the basics: kindness, patience, humor, family, and faith. It wasn't flashy, but it was solid. It wasn't loud, but it lasted. One evening, as she and her boyfriend sat by the sea in Cebu, she realized something profound. Back home, love often felt like a battle of expectations. Who would call first? Who would say sorry first? Who would give more? But here, love was simple. There were no scorecards. Just two people, grateful to have found each other under the sunset. He reached for her hand, smiled, and said softly, "You know, you're my forever." And she believed him, not because of the words, but because of how he said them. The narrator closes this chapter with a warm reflection. That love, no matter where it's found, mirrors the soul of the people who give it. The Ukrainian man taught her strength. The Filipino man taught her softness. Both are beautiful, but when blended together, they create something even greater. A love that laughs through hardship, that forgives quickly, that chooses happiness even when life is uncertain. And in that mix of strength and tenderness, she discovered something universal. That maybe the truest kind of love isn't about who's right or wrong, but who's willing to stay kind, patient, and funny even when the world feels heavy. Because in the Philippines, love isn't just about romance, it's about joy. It's about faith that even when things go wrong, there's always a reason to smile again. When the plane finally lifted off from the tarmac of Manila, Daria stared out the window and saw the city lights fade beneath a thin layer of clouds. It had been months of laughter, confusion, rice-filled mornings, karaoke nights, jeepney rides, and endless smiles from people who treated her not as a guest, but as family. She wasn't leaving the Philippines. She was carrying it with her. Her phone buzzed with a message. It was from Miguel, the Filipino boyfriend she never expected to fall for. He had written, "Don't forget, huh? Rice 3 times a day and always smile even when the world feels heavy." That's the Filipino way, she smiled, shaking her head, remembering how he used to tease her for eating bread for breakfast instead of rice. Now, as she leaned back in her seat, she reflected on how much she had learned, not just about love, but about what it means to care deeply, humbly, and selflessly. The difference between Filipino and Ukrainian men, she realized, went far beyond habits. It was about the way they viewed life itself. In Ukraine, love had always been intense, like the winters. Passionate, fiery, proud. But in the Philippines, love was warm, like a gentle breeze after rain. It was the kind of love that didn't demand. It simply gave. She remembered one particular evening in Cebu. Miguel had taken her to his parents' house in the province. The road was rough, the air smelled of sea salt and mango trees. His mother, a woman with kind eyes and a laugh that filled the small kitchen, had cooked adobo, pancit, and of course, Filipino-style sweet spaghetti. Daria had offered to help, but his mother only said, "You sit, anak. Your family here." That word, anak, child, had hit her differently. In Ukraine, family gatherings were formal, polite. Here it was chaos and laughter, Spoons clinking, kids running, uncles singing. But in that noise, she found peace. She found belonging. As she watched Miguel play with his nieces, lifting them high as they giggled, she saw something she hadn't seen before in any man she had dated back home. Effortless kindness. No showmanship. No trying to impress. Just presence. Just heart. In Ukraine, men showed love through grand gestures. Gifts, dinners, promises. But Filipino men? They showed it in small ways. Carrying your bag. Texting, kumain ka na, even when you said you weren't hungry. Saving the last piece of fried chicken for you. There was another night she would never forget. The night of the blackout. It had rained hard, the lights went out, and the whole neighborhood was covered in darkness. Instead of frustration, the Filipinos outside started laughing. Someone lit candles, another brought out a guitar, and before she knew it, everyone was singing. Miguel handed her a candle, saying, "Welcome to Brownout bonding." She had never felt so alive. No one complained, no one panicked. It was as if losing electricity brought out even more light in them. Later, when they sat under the stars, she asked him, "Why do Filipinos always laugh? Even when it's hard?" He smiled, touching her hand. "Because if we don't, who will? Life's already heavy. We just make it lighter." Those words stayed with her. When she returned to Ukraine, her friends noticed the change immediately. She was softer but stronger. She smiled more, hugged longer. She used words she never used before. "Ay nako, grabe, sige lang." And sometimes, when her Ukrainian friends asked her about Filipino men, she laughed and said, "They're the only ones who will love you and feed you at the same time." But more than that, she began to teach them what she had learned. The concept of pakikisama, the quiet grace of hiya, the deep gratitude of utang na loob. Her Ukrainian boyfriend before Miguel had loved her in his own way, direct, passionate. But it had been like fire. Bright but short. Miguel's love was like a home-cooked meal. Simple, constant, and always warm. Months later, Miguel came to visit her in Kiev. It was winter. He had never seen snow before, and he ran outside, laughing like a child, throwing handfuls of snow into the air. "Ang lamig!" he shouted, his breath turning into mist. Daria watched him from the doorway, heart swelling. For once, she was the one watching someone else adapt to her world. He slipped a bit, falling on the icy path, and laughed again. "Ay, kawawa naman ako," he said, using his favorite phrase. She laughed so hard she almost cried. That night, they cooked together, half Filipino, half Ukrainian meal. Pancit and borscht, adobo and pierogi, and for dessert, Filipino sweet spaghetti. When they ate, he smiled and said, "You know, this spaghetti is the same as love. Sweet, weird, but makes you full," she nodded. He was right. When Miguel returned to the Philippines, Daria felt sad, but not empty. Their love had changed shape. It wasn't just between two people anymore. It was between two cultures. She began writing about her experiences, articles titled, "10 Things I Learned from Dating a Filipino," "Why Filipinos Laugh During Disasters," "How Sweet Spaghetti Changed My Life." Her stories went viral. People from both Ukraine and the Philippines started writing to her, saying they related, they cried, they laughed. Some even said they wanted to visit each other's countries. One Filipino man wrote, "Thank you for showing the world that our simple ways mean something." One Ukrainian woman wrote, "I think I want to try Filipino spaghetti now." Daria realized that what she had with Miguel was not just romance. It was a bridge. A bridge between worlds that had once seemed far apart. Months passed, and one day she received a message from a production team. They wanted to make a documentary about her story. A Ukrainian woman who fell in love with a Filipino man and the culture that came with him. They called it Rice and Snow, a Love Story. When it premiered, people from both countries watched it, some laughing, some crying. And in one of the final scenes, Daria said something that summed up everything she had learned. Filipino men and Ukrainian men both love deeply. But Filipinos, they love softly. Their love is patient. They love like they cook, slow, steady, with care. They love not just with words, but with actions. And that's what changed me. She paused, her voice trembling slightly. Love doesn't need to be perfect. It just needs to be kind. After the screening, she walked outside, the night breeze brushing her face. She looked up at the sky, half expecting to see a shooting star like the ones over Cebu. Instead, she whispered to herself, "Salamat Pilipinas," because in the end, It wasn't just about who made the better boyfriend. It was about how love could transcend habits, accents, distance, and culture. It was about how a Ukrainian woman learned that true love isn't about how loud someone says, "I love you," but how gently they hold you through storms, brownouts, and laughter. And maybe that's the secret the Philippines had been keeping all along. The secret that no one could ever fully explain. Only feel love in its purest form is mahal na mahal.